Hello.
Hello.
We're back again.
Thank you for inviting me.
This is Kripcha, and he's Shabazz,
And he's Pete Marshall.
and we have a guest today, all the way from Germany. We have Inga. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Inga. I grew up in Germany, but then did my A-levels in the US, did my undergrad in Germany, and moved to the UK in 2014. So that was like 6 years ago now. At the moment, I'm stuck in Germany because I was originally here to do some field work for my PhD research, which we can also talk about later. But then COVID broke out, so I thought I'd stay here for a while. But I'm hoping to be back in the UK in October. I moved to Leeds to do a PhD at the Center of Disability Studies, which is sort of a very renowned institute for the academic field of studying disability oppression and disabling barriers at the University of Leeds. And my research is looking at young disabled people's imagined futures and sort of stories of navigating post-school transitions to either employment or unemployment or something in between. So it sort of looks at comparative social policy, work capability assessments and all that stuff, and also how young disabled people sort of define themselves and imagine their futures. Yeah, that's sort of what I do. And I also am a part of Greater Manchester Coalition of Disabled People and try to do a little bit of disabled people's activism in Germany. Yeah.
So, could you help us unpick your PhD title to begin with?
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, sure.
Could you just go through it bit by bit?
Yeah, so the title of my PhD is Young Disabled People's Imagined Futures, Narratives between the Boundaries of Work and Welfare in Germany and the United Kingdom. So the idea is I applied for a PhD studentship that was already sort of a little bit predefined. Sometimes they do that when like there's a professor at a university who already has an interest in something. And my original supervisor, who later unfortunately had to leave the university because it wasn't made very accessible to him, which is a whole other topic, was really focusing a lot on sort of employment for disabled people and the social policies that sort of control who gets to engage in sort of wage labor, who doesn't, which people are relegated to the margins and just told, oh, but you can just be on like employment and support allowance, or what is now the limited element of work capacity on universal credit forever, and you don't need to work, which on the one hand can be great for them, but especially for a young person, that can be quite demotivating. You go through school and like they say they'll prepare you for like the rest of your life, and then you try to join the labor market and people sort of underestimate your capabilities and actually say, oh, why aren't you just happy on benefits? And then there's the other group of people who might get forced into jobs or training that isn't very inclusive and accessible to them, and might get forced to take part in work placements, even though that sort of harms them because there's so many disabling barriers in their way. And there's been some like quantitative research, so statistical research, that basically found out that young disabled people's aspirations in the UK drop between the ages of 16 and 24. So when you ask people aged 16 what they want to become professionally, what jobs they can imagine having, and basically what they want to do in terms of wage labor in their lives. They tend to have the same professional aspirations as their non-disabled peers at age 16. And then they were asked again at like age 18 and 20, and asked again at age 24. And what this quantitative research found was that across the board, no matter what their sort of impairment type or impairment label was, young disabled people seemed really disillusioned at age 24, and at age 24 didn't have the same aspirations as their non-disabled peers, when at age 16 they still wanted to become similar things. And we think that that happens because they leave school, they start vocational training, or they go to university, they try out different work placements or internships and things, and then meet loads of disabling barriers when it comes to trying to join the labor market, and just get very frustrated and disillusioned. And we don't really know what happens between that age span of age 16 and age 24. So my research is qualitative research, which in the academic world just means research that's focused on language and interviews and stories rather than numbers. So I interview people to sort of find out what happens to them in that time period. And because I'm from Germany and have some understanding of sort of the welfare system and the labor market in Germany, and how it was for me growing up in Germany as a young disabled person, when I applied to the studentship, I said, oh, how about I like compare the UK situation to the German situation? And I sort of like brought that in as my own sort of angle or specialism to the already proposed topics. So that's basically what I'm doing. I'm looking at sort of the experiences that young disabled people make after they leave school, before they enter the labor market, and how that shapes how they see themselves and what they want to do with their lives. Because I've noticed that young people in general get asked a lot, like, oh, what do you want to be when you grow up? And people usually don't mean like, what type of person do you want to be? Like, I want to be a great friend, or I want to be a good neighbor, or I want to be...
It would be a better world if they did.
Yeah, but like people usually mean what you want to do to earn your income under wage labor capitalism. And because that's such a defining question, and young people get asked that over and over and over again, I just wonder, like, what happens to young disabled people who notice that that system might not be very accessible to them, and so they have to define who they are and what their life is going to look like in the absence of wage work. You know, and obviously if we built a culture where that question, what do you want to be when you grow up, would encompass more things and wouldn't be so focused on wage labor, then maybe that would be a less frustrating experience. But because our society seems to be so focused on work, and work even in policy terms is often seen as the path to social inclusion, like when the government publishes guidelines and policies and plans on social inclusion, if it focuses on young people or sort of working age disabled people, one of their main messages has been the way to include disabled people is to include them in the labor market. And I'm like, how about social inclusion for disabled people who can't or don't want to be part of the labor market? Like, why is that the only option to socially belong? And that's sort of what my PhD tries to unpick by just looking at different people's life stories and looking at how they've dealt with that, but also looking at what sorts of barriers sort of different policy institutions and schools and career services and universities and training centers have sort of put in their way.
It's interesting. There was a discussion. There's a book I know from the BAME community that talks about how if you're an African American, then you don't have a midlife crisis, because basically you've already gone through so much, like so many disabling barriers that you will have gone through before that. So basically, this is kind of the same thing in that sense. That honestly, you've already hit the barrier of opportunities that you will never get, and therefore, like.
Yeah, and I think that that quantitative research I mentioned, that my original sort of research proposal idea sort of stemmed from, also dispels this myth that disabled people don't achieve because they're not trying hard enough. Because it's like, it's not that they have low expectations of themselves. If that were true, then if we asked them at age 16, they wouldn't have the same plans as their non-disabled peers. What is surprising, or maybe not so surprising, but like evident, is that when they are asked at age 16, we find across the board that they want to become the exact same things. And okay, when you're 16 years old, you might not have so much experience of what the real world out there is like. But what I think is important to emphasize here is that these young people believe in themselves, and they believe that they can do things with their lives, and that's why they have the same dreams. And then something happens, and I basically want to know what that something is. And obviously in the UK context, what also comes into that is all the cuts to disabled people's benefits and all the cuts to unemployment benefits in general, and the introduction of the work capability assessment and sort of that policy regime that basically blames people for their own unemployment, tells some disabled people that they aren't ill enough to not be in wage labor, and sort of forces them to find whatever job they can find, no matter whether it is detrimental to their health and well-being or not. And I also wanted to see, okay, and how far does this apply to younger people? Because the whole idea of we have too many people on disability benefits in the UK, like that policy idea that you also read in the tabloid newspapers a lot, that usually gets applied to sort of middle-aged disabled people and sort of people who used to be maybe employed in coal mines and sort of manufacturing jobs that just now aren't as available anymore because the economy is changing and because companies produce those things, you know, abroad, or just different industries have died out. And so these people might have acquired health conditions across their the time they were in paid work, and then signed on to disability benefits. And then at some point the government went, oh my God, we have too many people on disability benefits, we need to do something. And I wanted to know, okay, is the thing that we hear about, that people get called scroungers and that the government basically tries to push them off benefits because they assume that they are sort of claiming benefits illegitimately, is that also something that gets applied to young people a lot? And obviously I'm not doing statistical research, so I can't say anything about prevalence, but what I found in my interviews is that even though young disabled people are much more likely to get parked on disability benefits, meaning they want to find work or training, but the government tells them, or like the job center tells them, oh, but like, we don't have anything for you, so just stay on benefits. There's still this fear that any day the job center could cut their benefits, or the DWP would cut their benefits. And so I feel like it's an ideological instrument that is used as a mechanism of sort of psychological control, because it keeps people on their toes, so to speak. And so, for example, you have people who are on the support group element of employment and support allowance, so those who aren't expected to take up work anytime soon and aren't expected to engage in any work-related activity. And the legislation says that technically you're allowed to engage in what they call permitted work hours and still receive your ESA component. Permitted work hours are usually 16 hours as long as you don't earn more than £125 and some pence a week. And that's an official regulation that not many people know about, but even the people who do know about it say, oh, I've been wanting to maybe do some permitted work, like just some odd job here and there, some freelance journalism maybe, or some, you know, start my own small business on platforms like Etsy or whatever. But I'm so afraid to even tell the DWP, hey, I'm looking into permitted work hours, because I'm afraid that then they'll say, oh, you can just go to work full time. So it's also these narratives and this sort of stigmatization of disabled people and benefits that even if in reality it's much less likely to apply to younger people, the fact that they hear about it all the time and that it's so present in everyday discourse means that it keeps them from exploring employment options and keeps them from trying things like setting up their own business and just, you know, doing the little things they can to earn their own money. Because even if, you know, from my perspective, it doesn't matter if someone works or not. I don't make a judgment on someone else. But I find that a lot of people tend to judge themselves, and they say, oh, like if I were able to just earn a little bit of money through my business, I'd feel so much better about myself. And that's where the whole idea of self-images comes in. So yeah.
Can I just ask you a few things? Firstly,
Sure.
Yeah. Firstly, what stage are you at in your PhD?
It's a long and complicated story that relates a little bit to the other things I was mentioning. So I had to switch to halfway through because I contracted chronic fatigue syndrome without knowing that it is ME or chronic fatigue syndrome halfway through. And I just realized that I didn't have the capacity to keep studying at full time. But then my tuition fees get paid by the Economic and Social Research Council, and they don't really do part-time. So then I had to apply to like switch to part-time for sort of disability impairment related reasons. And luckily I got that accepted. And so I'm hoping that I can write up this year. I'm sort of at the end of my fieldwork. I have to do the last few bits of my German interviews via video chat and an online webinar now, because COVID sort of buggered up my fieldwork plans. And then, so how it works is you then take your data and analyze it, and we're basically expected to write a book. Like, I think they cut us off at like 100,000 words, which is around 200 or 250 pages. And then you have like a viva where you present your research, etc. And I hope that I can get that done within a year or a year and a half. I technically have a bit more time, but I don't want to like use it all, because I feel like I've already done this since. So I did a master's from 2014 to 2015, which was like a 1-year master's, and that was super intense. And I think I tired myself out a bit, moving to a new country, figuring out how the healthcare system works, figuring out how I get my support, building up a new friend network, and doing a master's in 1 year. Yeah. And now I've done the PhD already since 2015. And I'm like, I just want to get it done. So I hope I'll be done in a year or a year and a half. But then whenever I get stressed out about that, I think, oh, well, in Germany, it's very common to take about 6 years to do your PhD, because the system works differently. You aren't really considered a student anymore when you do a PhD in Germany, but you get employed as like a research assistant at a university and do your PhD research project on the side. And so a lot of people take much longer to do their PhDs in Germany, because that they have their main income not from a scholarship, but from like a research assistant employment position. Yeah.
I was just interested, what made you kind of want to come and study in the UK? Because from where I'm sitting, the German system always appears a bit better to me than the UK systems. Is that not the case?
What do you think what exactly appears better to you, so that I can give you a specific answer?
The idea, I just have like a notion that the systems are much better run. I'm not basing that on very much, but it's just a feeling I get that the social safety net is better. And
okay. Yeah, I can give you the answer to that is a little bit complex, but I'll try to keep it as much to the point as I can. So the short answer is I did my undergraduate degree in sociology and political science and became interested in disability studies as a field sort of in high school or A-level time, like sixth form. But then in my sociology undergraduate degree, I sort of deepened that interest, but none of my professors really did disability studies. So I designed an independent study course and looked into it myself, and luckily found a professor who sort of did it with me. So we'd meet for coffee once a week and just discuss my readings, and I created my own reading list and everything. And I just found that a lot of the literature I was reading came from the US and the UK. And so I looked into the different options for graduate programs in disability studies. And we do have disability studies in Germany, but it's not nearly as well established as a discipline in Germany as it is in the UK. I'd done, as I said, my sixth form, my last 2 years of high school in the US, and sort of didn't really want to go to the US again because I feel much more comfortable in Europe. I'd always sort of wanted to study in Britain anyway, just because it's an interesting international experience. But then when I sort of designed my disability studies reading lists, I noticed that a lot of the research and the sort of publications I was reading came from the University of Leeds. The Center for Disability Studies there was set up in 1991, and they did a lot of the research. Their disability research unit did a lot of the research that led to the Disability Discrimination Act in 1995. So sort of the statistical research and qualitative research on discrimination against disabled people in the UK that would later lead to the DDA, which is the predecessor of nowadays Equality Act, in terms of protections for disabled people. And if I had stayed in Germany to do disability studies, the only way to do that would have been to go to a university that has disability studies professors, but it doesn't really have disability studies degree courses. Like, you take individual modules in disability studies, but you have to do a degree in either special education or rehabilitation science. And when I say special education, like from a GMCDP perspective, I would say segregated education. It's just that in Germany, it's still called special education. And for me, those disciplines have a very different focus. Rehabilitation science is about how you normalize and fix and rehabilitate the individual in order to make them fit into mainstream society. It has a very medicalized individual model cure focus almost, even though it's not about curing impairments, but it's still about normalizing the individual, rehabilitating them so that they fit into the mainstream, which is not what I'm interested in. And if I'd gone into sort of a segregated special education faculty, special education is all about how disabled children are inherently different and learn inherently differently from non-disabled people because of their impairments, which is also frankly BS and just a bad understanding of how humans work and how education should be done. And the segregated education system in Germany is notorious, not only for disabled people, but for people in general. Like, the German education system is extremely stratified. They decide, depending on which state, which of the 16 states in Germany you live in, they decide whether you go to grammar school, sort of medium level school, or basic school, which are 3 different sort of secondary school systems, at either age 10 or age 12. And only if you end up in grammar school can you go on to university. If you end up in the sort of medium level school, which we call Realschule in German, then you can still maybe get to university if you do like a specified A-levels, and go to like a University of Applied Sciences, like a polytechnic type university. But if you go to the sort of basic school, main school, Hauptschule, then you can't get to university at all. And they decide that when the kids are age 10 or age 12, so super early on. And it's all quite tied to sort of the German welfare system and how that historically emerged. Because so the German welfare state was born under Chancellor Bismarck. And Bismarck wanted to sort of appease the German social revolutionaries, like the communists back then. And in order to do that, he had to make sure that people in the middle classes wouldn't join the sort of revolutionaries' calls for, an equitable, social justice-oriented welfare system. And he did that by basically building class stratification into the German welfare system as like a cornerstone of the system, which is to say, he sort of promised middle-class people, if you support me, if you have an allegiance to me, I will build a welfare state that will not only make sure that you retain your middle-class privileges, but also that your children will have your middle-class privileges and their children will stay middle-class. And so it is quite difficult it's quite difficult to have downward social mobility in Germany, because once your parents went to grammar school and to university, it's very likely that you'll also go to grammar school and to university, because there are studies that say that for a gymnasium, which is the German word for grammar school, 70% of the pupils there have parents who also went to grammar school. So you can already see that sort of the education patterns replicate themselves. And that for students whose parents don't have an academic background, it's extremely difficult, or much more difficult, to get sort of sent to the grammar school system. And so that is true for the entire German education system, even for non-disabled pupils. And now, when you look at disabled children and young people, of course, the issue was they don't really fit into that system. If you promise people, in order to sort of what I would say squash their revolutionary desire, if you promise them, oh, like your children and their children will all be of the same social status, and you can keep your social status, and we'll ensure that in our welfare system, if a child is then born with an impairment or specific ways that their learning needs to be supported, then if the system is based on sort of the sort of homogeneity of people's learning styles, then that doesn't work, because you might have, the disabled child might have issues achieving the same marks and the same grades because the system isn't built for them. How did the German education system solve that? Simple, by just simply sending all disabled children to segregated schools. And it's gotten a bit better since the government accidentally signed the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2008. I say accidentally because I think when they signed it, they sort of, you have transcripts from sort of discussions in parliament where they sort of go, oh, but like every child in Germany goes to school. This is more of a convention for like those countries where disabled children get locked away at home and don't go to school at all. And so they signed it thinking that they basically already meet all of the UN's requirements, and because it looks good, right? It's always good to say you're for disabled people's rights. And then the UN committee is quite harsh towards Germany in their first state report when they did the first cycle of sort of checking all the states abiding to the convention. And it's like, yeah, all disabled children go to school in Germany, but you do realize that the convention specifically mentions inclusive education that provides equal levels of opportunity for disabled children. Your education system and your segregated special school system doesn't meet those criteria at all. You're not providing inclusive education that provides equal levels of opportunity to disabled children and young people. You need to overhaul your education system. Germany went, oops, and basically since 2008, there is, because of the UN Convention, a legal right to inclusive education, but we still have slightly over 60% of disabled children who get sent to segregated special school. And in the UK, in comparison, I think in England, it's 1%. The statistics for all of the UK, I don't really have in my head. But in Germany, there's a whole, like, very strong lobby behind the special education system. And special education teachers have a lot of privileges, and they don't want their profession to die out. So the entire industry that's behind sort of benefiting from keeping disabled people dependent and treating them as sort of separate but equal, what they claim, has a strong interest in maintaining that segregated system. And then you also have non-disabled parents who keep saying, oh, but it's better for my child to be in a protected environment away from non-disabled children who will bully them. And I'm like, yeah, but the bullying largely arises because people are being segregated from day one. Like when I entered school in 1997, there wasn't a right to inclusive education. And my parents really had to fight for me to go to the regular mainstream school in my local village. Actually, the school in my local village didn't take me because they said, we don't have a wheelchair ramp, we don't know how to teach her. And then luckily we went to the school that was just in the town next to ours. And luckily there we found a principal, a head teacher who was like, you know, if it doesn't work out, you can still send Inga to segregated school. We'll just give it a try. And then I went to school there. But like both of my parents have academic degrees. They both studied law. So they knew how to sort of confront a decision if the local authority had said you can't send your kid to mainstream school. They would have argued against that. If parents or families don't have the education background that it takes to challenge those decisions, it's still very hard to get their children into mainstream education. Now, I'm not saying the UK system is so much better, because I think what's happening in the UK is disabled young people get mainstreamed, but then don't get the adequate support they need in order to learn to the same level with the same support in the mainstream classroom. So that's not really great either, because it's sort of segregation within the same system, but at least they're more likely to meet non-disabled people, and non-disabled people are more likely to meet disabled people. Now, what you said, Shabazz, about like the sort of social security system being better in Germany, I would agree with you to the extent that that I think the general welfare system is more generous and has suffered a little bit less from austerity politics as they've happened in the UK. That said, when sort of the austerity, the sort of neoliberal austerity started to take hold under New Labour in 1997 under Tony Blair and the then German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, who by name was a social democrat, were best buddies, right? Just like Tony Blair was a Labour prime minister by name, but his policies were not very social. And so then we've had sort of austerity politics introduced in Germany at about the same time. And even Gerhard Schröder and Tony Blair co-published a paper, The Third Way, that was all about how to combine economic prosperity with social policies. I didn't find it very convincing. I think it caused a lot of damage. It introduced a lot of conditionality into the German benefit system as well. But the people who mainly suffer from that in Germany are long-term unemployed working class people, whether they're disabled or not. And the sort of narrative of disabled people as scroungers hasn't really taken hold in Germany yet. And I think some of that has to do with the history of the Nazi regime in Germany, and that people are very careful when it comes to that type of discourse. That being said, now with COVID, we see some of that re-emerging. People are saying, oh, but we need to protect the economy, so can't people who are vulnerable to the virus, many of whom are disabled people, just stay home forever so that we can revive the economy. So, you know, that discourse is always sort of there under the surface, and occasionally it bubbles up. Some of the discourse elements are much more similar to what the UK was like in the 1970s, where disability politics and sort of the public discourse around disabled people was still very paternalistic around, oh, disabled people need to be protected and they can't decide for themselves, so they should live in an institution. And medical professionals know what's best for them. And that discourse is still very strong. And there's loads of sort of disabled people's charities in Germany that are sort of comprised of medical professionals, social care professionals. But the healthcare system, I think, is better funded in Germany, and general infrastructure like public transport is better funded in Germany. So these, of course, are provisions that disabled people also benefit from. But when it comes to sort of specific disability-related provisions, I think the UK has a much stronger focus on sort of a liberal notion of anti-discrimination that doesn't really exist in Germany. And so to get back to where we started this whole thing, when I looked at studying disability studies, I wanted to study it from a sociology and a political science perspective that looks at how the system and how society and how policies disable people, right? And that doesn't really exist in German academia, because in Germany, the welfare state and the academic system and the entire discourse around disabled people is still very much like individual model, personal tragedy, medicalized and paternalistic. And so I wanted to learn more about the British disabled people's movement and sort of the push for anti-discrimination legislation in the UK, so that then I can take that knowledge and apply it here in Germany. Now, 5 years down the line, or 6 years down the line, of course, I've learned loads of new things. And I think now I sort of see the benefits and problems in both systems and in both settings. And I think both settings can be very exclusionary, but they're exclusionary in different ways, and they have different problems. People often ask me like, oh, what system do you think is better? And I'm like, I think they're both equally shit. They're just shit in different ways.
And how does the US fit into all of this then? You said you went to the US for a bit.
I think the UK and the US in terms of policy systems are quite similar, with the major difference that I think healthcare and social security for disabled people in the US is even more precarious than in the UK. So what I found very interesting is that when I was in the US, like I was on vacation with my parents before I went to school there. And we were driving through the desert on our way to somewhere. And there was like a public bathroom stop sort of in the middle of nowhere in the desert. And we stopped there and there was a wheelchair accessible toilet there. And I remember thinking, wow, like I can't imagine that a wheelchair user comes by here very often. Like, you know, given how many wheelchair users there are, know. I mean, I agree. Like, it was a positive surprise. But, you know, because the Americans had the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1991, they have to have wheelchair accessible bathrooms and facilities everywhere, even if the likelihood of a wheelchair user actually passing by there is very minor. And I found that very impressive because I'm like, in Germany, when you like drive somewhere that's quite rural, where nobody really like drives by that much, you would never find a wheelchair accessible toilet at like a parking lot in the middle of nowhere. It just wouldn't happen because people would be like, oh, there's no wheelchair users here. But like in the US, it has to be like that because it's the law. But that being said, I do think that the ADA provisions focus a lot on physical barriers and provision for people with physical impairments, and that they're much worse at other provisions for disabled people. I saw a lot more sort of people with visible impairments in public life in the US because there was that access there that I didn't know from Germany. But the US education system, as far as I know, is also very segregationist in ways that can be quite similar to the German system. And you sort of read articles about the school to prison pipeline in the US, where young Black children are much more likely to get sent to sort of special education programs. And then they sort of get criminalized and aren't given the same opportunities. And if we look at US healthcare, obviously you have no public healthcare in the US. So that's also a major burden for disabled people there. So you can see some sort of policy narrative differences in the sense that it's also very liberal and sort of being a free participant in the market, and sort of the liberal rights anti-discrimination focus is similar to the one in the UK. But then the social security system and the healthcare system, I think, is much more precarious than in the UK.
I mean, the most interesting thing, we had Dara Baldwin on a while ago. One of her major discussions around the American system, because yeah, she's a national disability activist, and she talks about care homes, and with them, they're a lot more of just a staple thing.
Yeah,
they are, and honestly, especially with the current coronavirus, they're just turning into a very, very bad entire thing. I suppose I'm mostly plugging the episode, so honestly, go back and listen to it. It's really good. Question in terms of how much do you think the special education schools in Germany end up getting something of like dumping grounds for lower class kids? Because I mean, part of the reason you weren't in one was because your parents are middle class, like. They went to university.
Yeah, but like that being said, I do think that even if you're a disabled child of middle class parents, the likelihood to end up at segregated school in Germany is still very high, because even my parents didn't quite know where to turn to when they had decided that they didn't want me to go to segregated school because it wasn't a legal right yet. Now it might be a bit different because of said UN convention, but the relation that you sort of mentioned to sort of working class kids and essentially poverty is a very strong correlation. I often say that like when people are like, oh, you're doing disability studies, it's such a niche topic. I'm like, no, it's not. Essentially, when you research how people are being disabled by society, what keeps them outside society, you realize very quickly that essentially disability research ends up being poverty research a lot of the time. And the other thing in the German education system that I think has some parallels to the US system and probably also to the UK system from my initial observations is that a lot of kids of color or kids from, in Germany, we would say children with migration background, but basically what it means is non-white kids.
So you're specifically probably Turkish. And
Turkish,
Syrian, I suppose, more recently.
Arabic, like any. So I think what happens is they enter school.
I think the finer point here is migration backgrounds doesn't imply differences in race. As a part, but your parents could have migrated from France to Germany, and they didn't have a migration background. So of
course it doesn't, Pete. I'm mentioning the term to illustrate how problematic that discourse is in Germany. That our official term for what in the UK would be BAME in Germany is children with migration background. You're of course perfectly right that white people with migration background don't get classified as such. But like that is the whole problem, that the racialization gets invisibilized because of course they don't say, oh, non-white children, because, you know, race is a social construct, right? So like, but the official term in Germany is like children with migration background. What that means in practice is non-white children whose parents or grandparents or great-grandparents have migrated from places such as Turkey, Arabic countries. Now a lot of Syrians have come to Germany in around 2015, you know, people from all over, even like, it's not only, I lie, it's not only technically non-white kids, but I guess whiteness is constructed. So like, but it would also apply to sort of people from ex-Yugoslavian nations, Polish migrants, like a lot of these kids, if their level of German is not at native level when they enter school, maybe because they speak sort of their parents' language at home, then instead of giving them proper support in school and making sure that their German is up to scratch, quite often it's way easier for teachers to label them as having an unspecified learning difficulty and sending them to segregated school. And that's how these schools end up being a dumping ground for children who are being racialized by white German society. And also end up being a dumping ground for people from socially disadvantaged, sort of economically precarious working class backgrounds. And that's a huge issue. So, you know, am I doing disability research? Am I doing racialization and poverty research? I don't know. I think it's all very intersectional. And that's where it becomes tricky, right? But it's also sort of, I'm trying to think of the technical term. I think they call it the resource labeling paradox. I might be wrong, but basically the theory is that in such education systems as the ones I'm describing, which is the German one, the US one, in order to get the support you need to support these children in school when they're struggling, either because they're of their language level or because teachers have prejudices against them, you know, their German might be just as good as that of their white German peers, but teachers might perceive them to struggle more in school because teachers have have racist prejudice, right? What happens is, in order to get the support resources they need, the teacher has to say to the Ministry of Education or the local authority, I have XYZ number of students with support needs in my classroom. And then based on the number of students they have with specific support needs in their classroom, they can apply for extra funding or extra staff support or extra training. So in order to give the students the support that they require, teachers have to label them as having quote unquote special educational needs. That label leads to stigmatization and segregation further down the line, leads to fewer vocational training opportunities or opportunities to enter university. And so it's sort of a vicious cycle. You know, some teachers might be well-meaning and might say, oh, I want to get this student the support, but in order to get that support, they then need to give them that label, and that label then is extremely stigmatizing. But I think you have similar sort of mechanisms in the UK. I have a friend who used to be a teacher in Bradford, and in his class, he worked with a lot of Rohingya refugee kids. And he said, you know, sometimes I think, oh, this kid is probably struggling, this pupil is probably struggling because they might have dyslexia, but any dyslexia test I can give them is designed for English native speakers. And so I can't even give them the tests that would be needed to get the support they require because they're based on the assumption that this child has English as a native language. And then I don't know, are they struggling because they're struggling with the language and they just need to catch up with the language and then it will be okay? Or is it a mixture of sort of a specified learning difficulty and a language barrier? And also, there's so many students in one classroom. If you have to take care of 20, 30 kids, like, it's really difficult for the teachers. I don't envy them at all. But, like, of course, that doesn't lead to an inclusive, supportive environment for all students, regardless of impairment label.
I just wanted to ask you, like, you know, to ask you a question about you know, once you've done your PhD, where, well, to use your friend, where do you see yourself joining the labour market? In what capacity do you see yourself joining the labour market?
That's an interesting question, because especially, like, you know, my research is very personal to me, because even though I do have a lot of educational privileges and I was sort of internationally privately educated, and I am aware that that gives me sort of a head start compared to a lot of other young disabled people. I've definitely also faced a lot of disabling barriers when it comes to employment. I'm thinking of sort of the, like, standard assumption that if you have a physical impairment like I do, I was born with cerebral palsy, then, you know, people think, oh, you're a wheelchair user, you need wheelchair access. And yeah, wheelchair access is great, and I want everything to be wheelchair accessible everywhere. But actually, this is not my biggest access need, because I learned how to walk when I went to conductive education physiotherapy in Hungary as a child. So I can take a few steps, and I need the wheelchair for long distances to manage my energy levels. What would be much more vital for me in order to engage well in a wage labor, primary labor market job would be flexible working times, because my fatigue levels and my energy levels are like much lower in the morning. I struggle a lot with sort of chronic pain and fatigue, especially in the morning. But I think there's this assumption that if you do a job, you've got to be there from 9 to 5. And people are never really sort of results oriented. Like, a lot of workplaces don't seem to care how much you get done in that time. But if you're physically present, they think you're being productive. And so sometimes I would drag myself to these offices and these workplaces to make sure I'm there at 9 a.m. but then I can't concentrate on anything until noon anyway. So I've just wasted like 3 hours just sitting there, making it look like I'm sort of productive, when actually, if they allowed me to come to the office at a later hour, I would be more awake, alert, and more productive. But that's not within the culture. It's very much, I think it's an issue of like employer control as well. So, you know, for me, things like remote working, doing some work from home, flexible working times are super important. And because people don't see that act as a requirement, it can be much more difficult to argue for that. And then I'm looking into, oh, do I want to, you know, start my own business? I could imagine doing some policy consultancy, because then you're sort of your own boss and like in charge of your own hours. And I think that would be really good for me. But then as a neurodiverse person, like I have ADHD, external structure is really important for me to be able to concentrate on tasks. So sort of having that responsibility to entirely manage your own time by yourself is something that also scares me. And then there's policy barriers as well, because in the German health insurance system, just like in the UK with national insurance contributions, just specific to health, your employer pays half of your health insurance. If you're freelance and have your own business, you usually have to have a private health insurance. Private health insurance tends to be much more expensive than public health insurance. And because I have pre-existing conditions and impairments, the insurance companies would probably put me in the sort of highest insurance premium group, because they see it as a higher risk that I might be ill and that they might have to pay for treatments. And so I would have to make a lot more money in order to pay my private health insurance contribution. And there are some options to get into the public health insurance as a freelancer, but it's much harder than if you enter an employment contract with an employer where the employer automatically pays half of your health insurance contributions. So, you know, even if I came up with this great plan on how I have my own business and can be in charge of my own hours, there's then other parts of the welfare system and the healthcare system that sort of give me a lot of anxiety as a disabled person, because I'm like, well, I need good healthcare. I know that I need access to physical therapy. I know that, you know, I'm not always 100% productive, but then if you know you need to make that much money to pay your health insurance, that puts you under a lot of pressure. So yeah, there's definitely also barriers I worry about for myself. And I know that, for example, living close to my workplace is super important for me, because even just getting to an office takes me so much more physical energy. Of course, that can be balanced out by sort of good public transport systems, but usually offices are sort of in the inner city where apartments are much more expensive. You know, it's all these different things. And yeah, I can imagine doing a lot of different things. And I really want to, you know, have a job and earn my own income. But I think psychologically and emotionally, I'm also sort of in the process of researching this topic. I've tried to distance myself more and more from this idea of you are what you do, as in you are what you work, because I think it can be very dangerous and it can be very toxic. And so I try to sort of define my identity or create my self-image based on multiple things and say, you know, even if wage labor doesn't work out, even if I struggle to find a job, because we know that employers discriminate against disabled people, even if my health is too unreliable to start my own consultancy firm or my own whatever, like, I still have things in my life that are important and valuable. I'm a good friend. I keep in touch with my family. I take care of my neighbors. I take care of my pets, you know, and all these things make life valuable and interesting and worth living. And I really want to get away from this idea of it's just wage labor that matters.
By the way, I was just saying that because that's what you used, so that's why I was bringing that up.
Yeah, definitely. Really, like
the question I wanted to end on was asking you what you wanted to be when you grew up, because, like, you know, that's what they ask every student.
They really do. I mean, when I was really young, I would say I want to become a veterinary doctor for forest animals, because I had this idea that, like, oh, pets get taken to the vet, but what about animals that grow up in the forest? 5-year-old me was very worried about sick squirrels, basically.
To be fair, squirrels and badgers need healthcare too.
Exactly. That was my concern as a 5-year-old. And then as I got older, like, I think as a teenager I had this idea of becoming like a judge, because both of my parents studied law, and they always said, oh, Inga, you'd be so good at law. I think they're right. I think I would have been good at law. So, like, the idea was, oh, maybe I could become a judge. Then I went to the US, and one of the courses I took was social anthropology, and I realized that I'm much more interested in questioning the system and questioning the rules that the system is based on, rather than learning them by heart and critically applying them. So, like, I think in law, you know, you learn a lot what the rules are, and you learn what the rules are so that you can apply them to different cases, and you can do so, you know, using critical thinking skills, and that's really important. But I was like, what if I disagree with the rules in the first place? What if I don't like the way the system is set up in the first place? And so I decided to study sociology instead. One of the first things my dad said to me was, all sociologists and political scientists end up on the streets. Never ask me for money. He was very concerned about the economic viability of my choices. And then I asked him how many sociologists he actually knew, and he said 0. And I'm like, there you go. And you know, people go into journalism. Like, it's one of those degrees that you can do everything and nothing with. And I think, like, I had this idea that I would really like to work at university, and I really enjoy teaching, like teaching seminars I really like to do. But university and academia is also quite a toxic, damaging system, and there's a lot of pressure, especially on young academics and early career researchers. So I'm not saying I don't want to go into academia, but at the moment it's not my primary plan anymore, simply because I've seen so many people burn out in academia, and universities, especially in the UK, but also in Germany to an extent, are run like businesses more and more. And so I want to carve out my own space, but I'm not entirely sure whether that would be within the ivory tower of the academy.
Pete, do you want to ask anything finally?
I think we're about done.
Yeah?
Yeah. Please come again. Please come on again.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure chatting with you, and it's been really interesting.
Yeah, I hope you got something out of it. And yeah, thank you so much for inviting me.
Okay. See ya, everyone. Bye.